like to introduce our speaker tonight, Douglas Gerwin. He is a Waldorf graduate himself, and he's the director of the Center for Anthroposophy, and he's the chair of its high school teacher education program in Wilton, New Hampshire, where I had the pleasure of spending 3 Julys with Douglas as I went through high school teacher training. He is the co-director of the Research Institute for Waldorf Education, and until this book came out, I know for me, he was best known for his survey of Waldorf graduates that he put together, and Douglas has been working on this book, Trailing Clouds of Glory, Essays on Human Sexuality and the Education of Youth in Waldorf Schools, for the past 12 years, and I really love how it's been described, from the clear thinking heart of the expert on teaching teenagers. So that is who Douglas Gerwin is for me. So you'll love his presentation, I'm sure, and so I will turn it right over to Douglas.
Thank you. And since you've heard something about me, I'd like to hear something about you. Let's begin, first of all, by seeing how many of you are parents in this school. Now let's break down the question. How many are parents in the kindergarten, preschool? And how many are parents in the lower school, first grade through fourth grade, 1 through 4? You can vote more than once. 5th grade through 8th grade. You're a parent in the high school. Good. You have survived a teenager. You've graduated a high school kid. Veterans. All right. You work at this school. Okay. You're visiting this school for the first time today. Anybody in that category? All right. Thanks. Welcome. And anybody been to this school as a student? Just one? There was one lurking around early today. He's escaped. Then let's see. Have you not voted yet? Did I miss a category? Oh, good. Okay, so you're all part of the season team here. All right, so you know the theme this afternoon arises from the title of the book, and I'll say a few words about this title in just a moment. But you may appreciate that this issue of human sexuality and so on has a certain measure of controversy in it. I'm going to try and sort of steer our way through various Scylla and Charybdis controversies in the course of the afternoon here. However, you may also have heard that I am by profession a high school teacher, teach teenagers, and therefore I am used to being interrupted. And if I don't get interrupted, then because I teach main lessons, I will speak in sentences lasting about 1 hour and 40 minutes. So rather than wait for me to run out of gas, I'd be much happier if you could point in and come in with comments and questions as we go, because there may be several as we go through the theme of the afternoon. Now to the controversies, which we'll pick up about 4 of them I want to see if I can adumbrate this afternoon. And they have, of course, to do with the question about what is this human sexuality. And I'll begin with a survey that was done in a legal battle having to do with the question which was asked kind of on the side, whether the computer is male or female. You know the answer to this? All right. How many of you would vote that the computer by nature should be categorized as male? And how many would say female? Most of the... All right, well, the vote was actually kind of split.
I'd say it's binary.
That's closer to what they came to because they wrote down the votes between the men and the women, and it was the women who decided that the computer was male. And they decided that because for 4 reasons, maybe 4 reasons, let's see. Well, one of them was the computer is male because they have a lot of data but are still clueless. Second, they're supposed to help you solve the problem, but in fact they are the problem. And we'll stick with 3 here. Male because as soon as you commit to one, you realize if you had waited a little longer, you could have obtained a better model. But now, the revenge of the men, who overwhelmingly voted that the computer should be characterized as female for, maybe 4 reasons also. First reason, why should the computer be female? Because no one but their creator understands their internal logic. I told you this afternoon would be controversial. Secondly, the native language that they use to communicate with other computers is incomprehensible to everybody else. And I'll skip to the last one. Even the smallest mistakes are stored in long-term memory for later retrieval. So you get to decide. But what's the theme of the afternoon, more about sexuality? I recognize that there are many topics now that are even challenging this distinction. Should we even be talking about male and female, masculine and feminine? And that's something I want to come to in the course of the afternoon, but only after I've done a bit of spade work. And the first bit of spade work should go back now to this title, Trailing Clouds of Glory, which, as you may know, comes from a famous poem by William Wordsworth, having to do with the incarnation of human beings on the earth. And this book began, and I'll tell briefly the story, it began in a conference of Waldorf teachers and medical doctors in Finland, in Lahti, Finland, north of Helsinki, where something approaching 900 people came together, as they used to do every 4 years, to address questions of health. I was in a group that was specifically charged then with looking at questions of health in regard to sexuality as it appears in the Waldorf curriculum. In the course of our deliberations, doctors and teachers both, we were horrified to discover that around the world, very few Waldorf schools, now this is early 2000s, very few Waldorf schools were actually teaching much about the subject. And those that were around the world were borrowing the public school textbooks from the state of Minnesota. For whatever reason. So out of that colloquium, out of that kind of conversation, that study group, the workshop, we recognized that work needed to be done. We needed to begin our own research, our own writing. And in that context, then, we decided that a book would come out of essays having to do with human sexuality as it would be treated in a Waldorf school. So that was the first thing. The second thing was that during one of the coffee breaks, I came out of one of the workshops and went down a huge staircase into the main foyer where 800 people were having coffee at the same time. You can imagine the energy that happens with that. And from the other direction came a very famous anthroposophical physician, maybe known to some of you, Michael Glöckler, and somehow we found each other in this melee in the middle of the coffee drinkers. And I reported to her what we had decided in this workshop in terms of coming up with a collection of essays, of course, in German on this subject. And she, in her very Germanic and utterly persuasive way, said, and you must do the English edition. But it took me 12 years to make that happen, because partly in going through the German edition, I recognized that some could be translated, but frankly, many essays were needed to speak to the North American scene, not just the European scene. And for that reason, then, I commissioned various teachers and various other people, physicians, counselors, medics, therapists, to do a kind of collection of essays addressing various questions. And that then resulted in this book that you see over there. So in terms of this book, it's not my task here to try and summarize it. It is about 400 and somewhat pages long. It was meant to be 2 volumes, but then we realized that 2 volumes are too expensive to publish, so it's a very thick 1 volume instead. I'm not going to summarize that. Rather, I want to address some of the issues, on the one hand, that came out of this research of a more, can I say, archetypal nature, and then, as time permits, to get into some more practical and also some more current issues, including these 4 or 5 controversies that we may be able to navigate through this afternoon. Again, I say, you should feel free to come in with comment and question as we go. Please do not wait for me to absorb the oxygen in the room in the hope that some is left for you by the time you go home. So then to, first of all, the theme. Let's see, where shall we begin? Yes. If you think about teenagers, you can appreciate that however they're born into the world, as boys and girls and now other combinations as well, when they come to puberty, it's almost as if they become 2 different races. If you put a 9th grade boy up against a 9th grade girl, we think they came from different planets. The boys still, to exaggerate, playing in the sandpit, in many cases blissfully unconscious, delightfully so, like puppies. And the girls, with eyes already on the senior class, looking ahead, much more mature, psychologically as well as physiologically, and as if they had been born out of a different society. Put it differently, for the years of adolescence, you can say the males and females are never more different than they are from each other during those teenage years. And that's significant because, as you know, only the human being goes through adolescence. Animals do not go through adolescence. The chick becomes a chicken with the second dentition and puberty. The puppy becomes a dog. The calf becomes a cow. The kitten becomes a cat. There's no catolescence. There's nothing in between. The playful little thing that bounces around and this kind of thing that sits in the window waiting for you to go away. A cat. So what is it about adolescence that is so uniquely human, and what is it about human sexuality that plays itself out during this very tender and uniquely human time? You may know that Mark Twain said that the human being is the only creature that blushes or needs to. And needs to because the teenager begins to awaken to a certain kind of reality about itself, be they male or female, that is usually embarrassing no matter how good things look on the outside. So this raising, this birthing of consciousness as a time of physiological change and uncertainty is part of the theme of looking at adolescence at this age. So what is going on here? As you know from your experience in Waldorf schools, you're aware of the fact that students work their way through various stages of development. And you know them well from the first years up through the first dentition in the kindergarten years, and in some cases even pushing into the first grades of elementary school. A second phase, and a quite different phase of learning, in which the students work their way through then from first dentition to the time of puberty, no later than 8th grade by now, often significantly earlier. And then a third phase after puberty, where they develop even further into full adulthood starting in the early 20s. Now we know much more than we used to about this third phase of development. It used to be thought that you were pretty much done when you hit puberty, and in earlier ages it was assumed once you were 14 you were an adult and you got on with adult behavior on the farm or in the court, or wherever your destiny might be taking you. But now we recognize that not only the skeletal system continues to develop significantly between puberty and early 20s, 23 typically, likewise the muscular system, but more recent research has indicated that the brain also is far from being finished at puberty. And small wonder they misbehave so much because they haven't got the apparatus by which to make higher decisions. That also, these so-called prefrontal cortex lobes, they too take much longer than we used to think to come to full development. They're there, don't get me wrong, they're there, they're simply not developed. So when do they finish developing? Well, there is one industry that is known all along when the brain has reached adult maturity. These are the car insurance people. They are. They will not rent a car to somebody who's 20, 21, 22, 23. They play safe with 25. 2 more years of buffer to make sure that you've arrived at the prefrontal existence. Then they will rent you a car as if you were an adult. So it's not a big news from the psychological level. It is, however, more news at the physiological level with the more recent brain studies which our machinery now makes possible. So we have this long process working through a physical development and what in Waldorf terms is called the life body being developed, then the soul body being developed, and only lastly with the 20s, the arrival of the captain aboard, that is a sense of I, a sense of identity, taking hold of this beautifully developed organism roughly in the early 20s. If you're lucky, the arrival of the full identity, the full person in charge is not so guaranteed as the spitting out of the first teeth. It's interesting that the earlier stages of human development are pretty predictable. You know, most of you got rid of your first teeth, I think. There are exceptions, and then they are physically extracted in puberty, painful but necessary. But for the most part, you just wait for little fairy to come along at night, pop those teeth out, you get a quarter, and you're done. That's easy. Second phase is now the phase of puberty, also is pretty reliable. Always exceptions, but pretty reliable. Sometimes a big surprise if you weren't prepared by parents or somebody else who was wise enough to tell you what's coming. But apart from being a surprise, it is predictable. But the next major development, now the full arrival of the human identity, the I, in the early 20s, or industries, film industry, fashion industry, some food industry, some car industries, were only too happy to perpetuate your adolescence as long as possible, because adolescents often are eager consumers. So it was when I was teaching at university, back in the last millennium, I have to say now. I taught in the Department of Child Development and also Education. And there, because you were in that department, you got all the textbooks advertising the latest theories about child development. I noticed as I was working my way through that with every edition, the book got fatter, because they kept adding a chapter at the end of the story. So then came a new edition with a chapter on late adolescence. The next edition had a chapter on early adulthood. And just before I got out of this racket came an even fatter textbook which had a new chapter and a new title called Medolescence, the second adolescence that kind of hits you on the side of the face around 35. So we can survive as adolescents much longer than we survive as either infants or children or even young teenagers. So there's something about this adolescence that has something free about it. It's not quite so prescriptive, not quite so set, and therefore can last significantly longer. But we're hoping that through this process of birth and first teeth, second teeth, puberty, and so on, the child is going through a process of arriving on Earth in an organism that is fully maturing. A process, to use a slightly fancier term, a process of incarnation. Now we come to our first controversy. And the controversy is, how do males and females take hold of these different aspects of their body? That is, its physical element, its living element, its emotional element, and its sense of identity. How do girls and boys take hold of these four aspects? And in looking at this, various anthroposophical physicians, and also the Rudolf Steiner before them, spoke about these four aspects of the human being as being significantly different in the way in which a male, compared to a female, takes hold of them. Now, there's controversy here because generalizations are dangerous, especially when you speak about sexuality, and especially as you speak about older children, students, in their sexual development. So this is a bit of a generalization. But if you think for a moment of these four fingers as representing these four aspects of the human being, that is, its physical nature, its living or life-body nature, its soul or emotional nature, and its sense of identity, then if you look at this lineup, then according to some of these physicians and also Steiner before them, he said that in the case of the girl, the female, she is more likely to take hold more fully of this aspect, the living aspect of the body, and to some degree this aspect of the body, the emotional. In their cases, they are usually more tuned into health. They're often a bit more conscious about what it means to be a living, healthy, living physical body compared to the guys. And in terms of their emotional life, it's much more interesting by comparison to the guys, for whom they are often blissfully ignorant of their physically health natures. They abuse their physical organisms with all kinds of testing. And as far as their emotional life is concerned, a little thin by comparison. If you know the author Robert Bly, the poet Robert Bly, he describes himself being a teenager and being sort of puzzled by the fact that when somebody insulted him, it felt to him like it was somebody shooting arrows through a very loose fishnet. And the insult went straight through him. You're talking to me? But if the same arrow, the same dart, was thrown at a girl's soul life, it was like being caught in a rich Persian tapestry, and would sting and hurt. And he was aware of the fact that his soul life was very thin by comparison to the rich texture of his female friends. So in that sense, for the girl, they take hold more fully of these two because by comparison to the guys who are kind of weak in this area, not quite so much to get a hold of. And correspondingly then, in the case of the guys, they're more likely therefore to take hold more fully of the physical organism. It's also denser and it also has more mass to it, and also in terms of taking hold of this eye. For girls then, to take hold of their physical organism compared to now their living organism, to take hold of their actual physical body may be more difficult. We have more cases of girls who wrestle with weight, wrestle with eating, wrestle with this whole body image than with guys, although that's now changing. And by the same token, Steiner describes how a girl, having taken so fully hold of her social and emotional life, may have difficulty prying that a little bit loose or free of a sense of identity. And then the sense of identity becomes more and more tied up with this rich life of the living emotions. Now put those two thoughts together. The guys coming into their world, into the world in this configuration. The girls coming in configuration in this way. You can see now the merit of coeducation. And that was one of the reasons why Rudolf Steiner insisted, already a century ago, almost, that girls and boys should be educated together, because he recognized that the strengths of each, and correspondingly the weaknesses of each, could help each other if they were learning together, even if they were in some cases getting in each other's hair because they were so different. So that's one aspect of what stands a bit at the back of this work, looking at human sexuality, starting from the assumption that typically, not always, but typically, the girls come in one way and the guys come in another. Now I mentioned a minute ago the situation of girls, mostly, but now increasingly with a number of boys, who begin to come into the world, who begin to take hold of their organism, even the physical organism, and then it's as if there's something that is repelled or repulsed from that process of arriving, that process of incarnation, and they back off. Menstruation that may have started in 6th or 7th or so grade stops. And now the girls begin often to live in their literature and their poetry into fantasies of flying and unicorns and Peter Pan images and characters who never grow old, a kind of eternal youthfulness flying off the earth without feeling its weight of gravity. And we're describing, as you may recognize, the first symptoms of what we now know as anorexia. I also mentioned briefly that this is now becoming more, although not as much, but more the case with boys, not for the reason, though, of taking hold of the physical organism, but rather because Ritalin is an appetite suppressant. And therefore, a quite different reason now, we begin to find cases of anorexia also with young boys. That's the one picture, the reluctance to take hold of the physical body, in that sense, staying too young too long. The other picture which goes with that is, far from slowing down the process of arriving or incarnating on Earth, we have the other picture then of getting on the Earth too fast. That is to say, kind of crash landing onto the Earth, perpetuating the future into the present time, rushing into life in the full physical body. Now, if you've had that experience, and I bet you have, even though not by this language, if you've had the experience of arriving, for example, in the morning or sometimes in the middle of the night, too quickly into your body, or if you're about to take off into sleep, and suddenly you're yanked back into your physical organism, you know what happens. A moment of spasm, a moment of, a case of where the body kind of clenches itself. This is, from the Wolof perspective, an example of the soul too quickly grabbing hold of the physical organism, either because you were startled awake or because you're anxious to get on with life on Earth. And what is the condition then of this perpetual spasming? Well, you may recognize this as another condition that is increasingly common in our time, and often with boys, although sometimes with girls too, but increasingly we find it in boys. And we give it a name. Used to be called ADD, and now because the ADD always has a lot of activity and of a kind of nervous spasmodic nature in it, we call it ADHD. Mostly with boys, but yes, increasingly also with girls. A case now not wishing to stay young too long, but almost wishing to grow old too fast. And these two conditions, I think, are uniquely potent in our times, and they have to do them indirectly with this process of incarnating into the different sheaths, you might say, the different aspects of the human body, either too slowly or too quickly. And in that context now, I want to look to see if we can say something more about the nature of the female incarnating compared then to the male incarnating. And to do that now, I spool way back into the earliest stages of gestation, the earliest stages of pregnancy and conception. I want to move now through the first 4 weeks in a much slower way to start to try and find something of these gestures of the male and the female as both come into existence. But first,
do you suppose that the timing and process for each individual person of incarnating is kind of predetermined, or is there like a nature or nurture component to that, or is that what you're going to be talking about?
indirectly, but to come to your question more precisely, could you all hear that question, by the way? Yes? Yes, you could hear it? No, maybe say it again, you couldn't be heard behind you.
Well, I was just asking whether the process of incarnating, as he's talking about, is predetermined, or if there is a nurture component to it, whether you can affect the process by which someone does that.
The question is yes, yes.
Okay.
Meaning that, yes, you can see a plan. Now, here's a fifth controversy, if you want to have controversies. A fifth controversy which Steiner offers. He says, these children, they figure out the parents they want 6 generations ahead of time. Think of the math involved in that. Getting all those great-great-great-parents together, an extraordinary concept. But a child would be so much engaged in Earth. It's an extraordinary idea. So that's the first part of your question. The second part is, yes, absolutely. We can really mess it up. Or we can really help it. And if we have some clue as to what the process is, we're more likely to be helpful than in the way. And if we have no clue, then we're likely to stumble around and get in the way. So yes to both. So let's look at some of these early stages now. And I want to start with the very first stage. And this is the stage of conception, that is to say, the stage of the zygote. I won't draw it on the board, you don't need that, because by now most people have pictures in their minds as to what a zygote is, a fertilized egg is. And bear in mind that a century ago, this would have been little known. And 2 centuries ago would have been unknown. Not because people were ignorant, but because this kind of information, this kind of story or image, was regarded as so formative and so important that it could not, should not be publicly held. So what I'm describing is not new research, although there are elements that are new. These are elements that actually you can discover, if you know where to look, in the ancient most times of mythology and history. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when the zygote begins to develop, it develops, as we now know, both male and female characteristics. Both. Right down into the preamble of the sexual organs. Both. This is, from the physiological point of view, recently discovered because of the instrumentation we now have. But as a concept, the concept of being hermaphroditic from the beginning, that goes back as far as I can track it. Part of my research for this book was, on the one hand, going into modern physiological research articles, but at the same time I also went to Egypt and had a chance to study ancient mythology there, and discovered that the most ancient of the Egyptian gods were both male and female. The god Hapi, for example, who is the god who gives birth to Egypt, because he has 2 vases into which then he pours into a 3rd vase the waters that become the Nile. As you know, the Nile has 2 sources, not one. And this god, who was responsible for pouring these 2 jugs of water into what would become the Nile, was himself, herself, male and female. Hapi is a hermaphroditic goddess. Zeus, now we're moving ahead into Greek times, in the ancient versions of Greece, not the later ones, but in the ancient versions of Zeus in Greece mythology, Zeus is also female male. And if you turn to the Hebraic tradition, where you have the story of Genesis, there's some, again, a mini controversy of language and translation as to how you shall translate the phrase in the first chapter of Genesis, or second chapter, in creating the human being, male and female made he them. How do you translate the word and? This does need to be on the board. So, male and female made he them. And one translation of this into English is to write it this way. Hyphenated. And meaning hyphenated. Male and female. So, earliest times speak of the originating of the human being in this both male and female way. However, at a certain point, a decision is made. That's to say, you're moving in a direction of being male-female, and now at a certain point, you can see roughly early on, by the 17th, 18th day even, very early on, a certain decision is made. It's as though you stop one set of developments and continue the other. And then you become female, or you become male. Now we come to the next little controversy, because in describing this, Steiner said, well, if you have formative creative forces going on here to create the human being in both male and female expressions, if you have such a formative force and you hold it back, you staunch it, you can't kill it. And it's a rule of nature that what you suppress at one level appears one level up. So from this point of view, if you imagine a being being created male and female, and a certain moment comes, and only, let's say, the male forces of forming continue, these forces don't go away, says Steiner. These forces now appear one level up at the life body, as opposed to the physical body. With the extraordinary implication that a person born male, physically male, will carry this feminine female aspect in his or her life body, or his body, his life body, and vice versa. That a person who then opts, shall we say, to develop a female physical organism will still have these male formative forces there, but not appearing in the body, physical body now, but appearing one level up in the life body. That means that we are whole. We are both male and female. The problem is, in most cases, we can only see half the story, because the other half of the story is invisible, or at least is barely visible. Some folks, they have a feeling for what a life body looks like, but it's an interesting question of how you might do that. Nevertheless, the notion that as we are born, we begin whole, we make a division, we make a cut, as it were, and half becomes physical, but that doesn't mean we're half beings. We are whole beings, but only half in our physical expression. Yes?
Can you speak more to what a life body is?
Yes, of course. Thank you for that, because this is a difficult thing to put into words. What does Steiner mean by the life body? The first quick answer to say that is to distinguish between the corpse and the body. Whatever you just distinguish there, that's the difference we're getting at. You may know that the corpse weighs more. It's literally a dead weight. That's a different kind of weight. Has no pressure in it. The living body, even if it's physically the same weight, it feels lighter, easier to carry a body than a corpse. Like a sack of potatoes versus a baby. And beyond that, in this living body, there are certain things it can do that it can't do when it's a corpse. More precisely, it can't reproduce, can't breathe, can't regenerate cells. So all of that which we describe in terms of regeneration of cells, of health, of habit, of all the things that have to do with our nourishment, diet, transforming substance into our own substance, all of that activity are aspects of what he meant by the so-called living body, the life body, the etheric body sometimes called. And, to go one step further with that, He described this body sometimes as the body of formative forces, another synonym there. And he said this body not only can form your body, that is your physical organism, by creating your cells and so forth, it can also, at a certain point, create mental pictures. That the creation of images in the mind is also a kind of forming. And he says that it's derived from the same strength, you might say, the same forces that give rise to your physical form as well. That is why Wittgenstein spoke about the kindergarten being so different from the lower school. He described how these formative forces are really busy in those first years, working on that little teeny tiny body that you were given more or less at birth, but now you have the huge task of completely refashioning it over a period of up to 7 or so years in your own image. And that's a big task. And the signal that you've completed the job is, oh, the first teeth come out because you can't replenish those. You can't replace those first teeth. They're too calcified. So the only thing you can do is get rid of them. And then another set waiting to descend, of course, push them out. So even there you have actually redone the teeth, even though you didn't actually transform the dentition, you simply replaced it by 7%. All of that, says Stein, is the work of the etheric body. And only when the body, the etheric body that is, has finally completed that task, can the child now go to school and begin to use some of those same formative forces for the creation of mental pictures and ideas of school. And that's why in Waldorf schools you wait, kind of, if you can. You wait until that process has reached a certain maturity before you begin to draw upon those forces for more intellectual pursuits. Does that help? Thank you for that question. It's very helpful. Okay, let's go now to the zygote. Back to the zygote. And here I want to, if you allow me, walk you through 4 phases, roughly the first 4 weeks of gestation, in which the zygote now goes through 4 gestures. And these 4 gestures, I think, relate loosely to these 4 bodies. First, what happens with the fertilized egg? 1 egg, 1 nucleus. It divides. And I have to back up just 1 second to say that this 1 fertilized egg with this 1 nucleus should not be imagined as the combination of the father's nucleus and the mother's nucleus. We have, forgive my saying this, no evidence for that. What do we have? We've now done the studies, we've been able to watch, often in the petri dish, you can watch the entry of 1 sperm, not many more, 1 entry, 1 sperm into the larger egg of the female. And then if you continue to watch, you notice that the nucleus, the tiny nucleus of the sperm dissolves and disappears to physical observation. The same with the nucleus of the egg. It also dissolves and disappears to physical observation. There is, to use musical language, a kind of fermata. Oh. And then if you're willing to be patient and listen a little longer, past the fermata, then somewhere, usually somewhere else inside this egg, a new nucleus appears. And we are not allowed to say, because we cannot see, whether this new nucleus is simply Humpty Dumpty, the repatching of the male and the female nuclei, or is it something else? Physically, we're not in a position to say, although some people would love to speculate. Nonetheless, we have arrived at the fertilized egg with a nucleus that was somehow created, I'll leave it that way, and now, as you say, the cleavage, the first cell division. Cell division 1 into 2, and 2 into, not necessarily. These textbooks, you see, they're kind of sleek, and they're kind of geometric, and they're kind of clean. 2, 4, 8, 16. That's very neat, but it's not accurate. Because if you watch carefully, some will do that, but others will divide 2, 3, 5, 7, maybe 16, and then 20. Yeah? It's not so mechanical. It's not according to a metronome. And that leaves open a wonderful question as to whether there's a difference between those cells that divide or subdivide more swiftly compared to those that do not. We do not have evidence to help us there, but it's a question I have to leave you with. Nonetheless, cell division. Now the point of the story is that as we go through this cell division, more and more and more and more cells subdivide, but the zygote doesn't get any bigger. That means that within the same membrane, more and more and more and more and more divisions are happening. You can appreciate that it's kind of getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter in there. I'm thinking of rush hour in Tokyo, when they push these people into the subways, with kind of huge sort of bands of wood just to kind of squeeze more people into the same size carriage. That's what's going on with the first phase zygote. And that first gesture, that gesture of compaction, contraction, getting tighter and tighter and tighter, if that were the rest of the story, that would be fatal. You would not survive that indefinitely. Something else has to happen. In fact, if you take mathematically 100 zygotes, 60 of those zygotes will not survive this first gesture. 60% of fertilization, as far as we know, go no further than this first gesture of contraction, compaction, condensation. A second gesture is needed. And this now takes us from the first stage to the second stage. In rough numbers, this first stage is in the first week, maybe less or more, but basically fewer days, but still no more than a week, this gesture. And now we move into the second week, where the zygote become morula, which sheds the outer membrane, looks like a little mulberry or raspberry, that's why it's called a morula. Now moves into a second phase by now typically having arrived in the uterus, having moved through the fallopian tubes, most pregnancies happening in the fallopian tube, move now into the uterus, and now we're ready for the next gesture. And for those of you who do eurythmy, you can already predict what that second gesture is going to have to be. You can only contract so far till you have to. And this is now the second gesture in what is called the trophoblast, or the blastular stage, in which, for the most part, this now no longer zygote begins to expand by comparison, enormously to the previous state, reaching out, losing its sort of round spherical shape, becoming weird, ovoid, beginning like fingers to reach into the blood vessels of the uterine wall, and in this case becoming an enormous, by comparison, enormous organism. On the one hand, but when you move from the first phase to the second phase, you don't obliterate the first phase. This first phase of contraction remains in a few cells that kind of hang together like a little boys' club, or girls' club depending, in one part of this blastula, and that's the embryoblast. That will become the embryo later on. This other huge expansion will become in part then the placenta. These two gestures, the one of concentration, compaction, the other one of reaching out and spreading out in this way, has a very interesting experiment attached to it in the blastular phase. Now see if you can follow this. It's maybe a bit complicated. I'll see if I can do it. Mechanically now, it's possible, and this was done with mice, mechanically it's possible at the blastular, or even just pre-blastular stage, it's possible to go into that nucleus, even in the early stages before it subdivides, to go into the very earliest zygotic stage and manipulate the nucleus. And two manipulations were done. In the first case, in this nucleus, and please don't ask me how they did this, in this first nucleus, they were able to extract the male nucleus before it dissolved and inserted a second female nucleus. So now the zygote is under the influence of two female nuclei. You follow? Mm-hmm. So this mouse now, or this embryo mouse, is under the influence only of female characteristics or DNA. And what happens in a case like that? These, in the blastular stage, these embryoblastic cells continue to develop. The trophoblastic cells that were reaching out and atrophy and die off. Now they did the second experiment. Same idea in the zygote. You take out now the female part, or the female nucleus, and you insert a second male nucleus instead. So now you have a zygote developing under the influence only of male DNA, two male nuclei. And what happens there? embryo in the blastula stage, the embryoblastic cells do not develop. And the trophoblastic cells continue to expand and expand and expand and grow. So at least at the embryonic and the biologic and the DNAic level, we can identify two gestures, one concentrating, internalizing in that sense, the other spreading out and externalizing, as having something to do with the nature of this female developing and this male developing. And at least in terms of the external symptoms of human sexuality, you can see that gesture replicated in the adult male and the adult female in terms of their sexual organs. The one, organs retained inside, the others, the organs clearly expressed outwardly. And that leaves a question as to what gesture is which, and to what degree we can think of a feminine gesture or a masculine gesture, at least in terms of the physiology. You could go further if you wish, but for the moment, to stick with the physiology, I hope you can see that even experimentally, we can demonstrate how the one gesture has one sexual gender attached to it, and the other gesture has the other gender attached to it. And that's phase 2. How are we doing? So far, so good? Not too much heat in the room yet? Okay. You're a good audience. By now, I've had some people walking out, in protestations of, masculinism and feminism. Here we go, let's go. One by one, off we go. But let's move on. Because we've arrived now at the second week, the stage of the blastula, and now we have to go to the next phase. Because if you imagine this gesture as being fatal to 60%, this second gesture of dissolving and expanding and so forth is also fatal unless it has a third gesture coming behind it. And indeed, of the 60 zygotes now, blastulas remaining, another third, so 20, are going to die at this second stage as well. They don't survive the second gesture. So now we're down from 100 to 60, from 60 to 40% survival rate. And we enter the third stage, roughly speaking in the second to third week. And what is this third gesture? Now, for those of you familiar with the approach to science that Goethe developed, or even gestures you might have practiced in eurythmy, you know that you can have one gesture of concentration, a second gesture of release or expansion. But you can do more than that. You can find a way to combine elements of both. That is, elements of both contraction and simultaneously expansion. And when you do that, when simultaneously you wish to go to a center, at the same time you wish to expand to the periphery, then you're introducing a kind of tension, shall I say, between the two. And that brings us to the third phase of gestation. In roughly the third week comes not the zygote, not the blastula, now comes a third stage, which is called the gastrula. And the gastrula combines elements of the previous two gestures, although they are transformed. On the one hand, to get a sense of this expansion, but at the same time, this gesture of contraction, which comes then in the form that we know of the kidney shape. And we're on the way, just about we're on the way, to moving from this gastrula to what we would then call a full fetus. But we're not quite there yet. Because in this stage, the third stage, we are creating something else. When you move from what was essentially just a collection or a circle with cells in it, and then you move to this blastula stage, shapeless with a little embryonic in the middle there, that's pretty rough. To this stage, you've moved from one kind of dimension to another. For as long as we're talking about this stage, there really is, it makes no sense to talk about dimensions. It's just a kind of a collection. When we go to this stage, already it's possible to begin to talk about an up and a down in this blastula stage. And when we get to this stage, now you can begin to see there's a back and a front. There's a dorsal side and a ventral side. This will eventually become represented as the spine, although this this is not the spine, but eventually the gesture will be expressed through the spine and the skeleton even. And this will be then, obviously, where the umbilical cord can grow, the ventral side and the dorsal side. And here, we're almost at the end of the story, because we've now got three gestures. The first, the concentration; the second, the expansion; the third, the kind of combination of that, giving you this gesture of involution, or scooping out a space in the front, which gives you a front different from the back. Fancy language, this phase of imagination. Now we come to the last week. There's one more gesture. And this gesture is much more subtle, because the being that we're looking at is, in a certain sense, still somewhat curled over in this gastrulated state, like a kidney bean. But nonetheless, even within this kind of curved state, you can begin to see a fourth gesture, which, to put it simply, is the formation of a tube, sometimes called the neurula, the development of a tube, a straight line. And a straight line that's going to have consequences. More precisely, there are two straight lines. One straight line is going to become, later, the straight line of the spine, with, of course, the brain at one end of it. And the second straightish line, straight because it's continuous, is going to start at the anus and the mouth and become then the gastric tube. That is to say, throats, larynx, stomach, intestines, more intestines, rectum, anus. And notice that the first one, this is now the spinal and the brain tube, this system will be closed at both ends. If one is open, that can be fatal. Spina bifida is fatal. The other tube, of course, has to be open. And if for some reason one of those closes, that's also fatal. So we have to have two tubes, and they have to have the complementary qualities of being closed, open. So it's complicated. But nonetheless, open or closed, the gesture is this, neuralization is this forming of a tube or a straight, or in the direction of a straight line. It doesn't achieve it, but it's in that direction. And that's the fourth week, roughly, or sometimes third week, but fourth week. And that brings us then to this neurula, and the gesture not of contraction or of expansion or of this kind of involution, but now of this identity of the straight high line. And these four gestures, 1, 2, 3, 4, these you might appreciate have some relationship to these four bodies. What is it? What is the nature of the physical organism? Its density. If it's only physical, it's the corpse. And the corpse is the ultimate dense and therefore heavy sack of potatoes. The life body, which of course works with the physical body, but nonetheless, if you could somehow tease out the life body to itself, Steiner describes that. He says, if you study water, you get a much better sense of how the life body would operate if it were operating by itself. And as you know, if you want to study water, you have to study surface. Water moves in sheaths, in sheets. It looks like drops, but that's because of gravity. But take the gravity away and just let water be water, and although it sometimes coagulates, essentially it moves in sheets. If you watch a river, it's not a big sausage of water coming down the tube, it's sheets, and that's where the waves come in. There are sheets of water interacting with each other, moving like fish, but like bass. Is that bass? No, the flatfish, what are they called?
Flounder.
Flounder, thank you, the flounder. Moving like sort of lily pods or lily pads down the river. Sheets, surfaces. And therefore, that's the second. The third gesture, now this is not the concentration nor the surfacing out. This third gesture, this gesture of involution. When Rudolf Steiner describes not so much now the life body, but the body of soul, he says it's the nature of the soul to live in the tension of opposites. This is, again, common sense. If I could, I can't, but if I could tell you a story that was really funny, I mean really, not just humorous, but really fun. If I could get you to laugh, no, to guffaw, to actually fall off your chairs and begin to roll down these steps and out the door, laughing, if I could do that, there would come a moment, would there not, where your excess of laughing would turn into weeping. And the reverse. If you're miserable long enough, you end up laughing at yourself, which is the only cure to misery. So we know in our soul lives, and you can go through a bunch of emotions to find that they come in complementary pairs. Mars and Venus are classic examples of soul complements, and there are others in the planetary spheres and in the skies generally, but also in the soul life. We have these emotions in, like animals going onto the Ark of Noah, they come in pairs, and they are complementary opposites. Mutt and Jeff, Lauren Hardy, they all come in twos. So in the emotional life, we're constantly living with what Aristotle calls polarities, that is to say the collision of opposites of emotion. And that is represented in this symbol here of opposite gestures, the one that would reach and stretch, and the other one that would collapse and involute. In that sense, this gesture here is a kind of representation of the genius of the soul life, the emotional life. And then finally, it may be obvious to say that if you think of the gesture of the eye, that which stands, that which has integrity, that which can stand in the wind, especially out here in Colorado. Woo. Had that this morning in Boulder. You can appreciate then this strength of identity, this strength of I am, being represented by this pillar of light, or this pillar of a line straight. So, very briefly put, these 4 phases, these 4 early weeks of gestation, in their gestures, may have some relationship then to the unfolding of these 4 aspects of the human body. So, are you ready for another controversy? Or do you want to take a few comments, questions as an interregnum break here? Should I sit down for a moment? Give you a chance to come back into the room.
So is it not an accident that female genitalia are convoluted and male genitalia are linear?
That would be my suggestion, at least in the gesture of the trophoblast and the embryoblast.
You described ADHD and gave it a feeling that it was someone rushing toward trying to grow up too fast, and I didn't really catch that, and I'm not sure if this is the moment to ask it, or if you would want to think about that later. Just curious to know.
Let me maybe hang on to that, because that's going to take us a bit away from
Yes.
embryology and sexuality, but
Okay.
hang on to that, because that, if there's more to mine there, we should do that, so don't we forget
Later.
that. But closer to the topic, anything else for the moment? Okay, so let's go to the next controversy.
Wait, I just thought of a question.
Ah, yes.
Sorry. So you're talking about human embryology.
Yes.
Is this, how equivalent is this like in other mammals or other kinds of animals?
It's very different with animals. If I can give you one quick expression of that. If you think of the placenta, in the human, to begin with, the placenta fully surrounds the sacs around the embryo. Then it kind of atrophies a bit, and then focuses at one place, which will become the place for the umbilical cord to connect. But the first gesture of this placenta is all embracing. And the placenta itself, as you know, tends to be disc-like, round. That's changing, by the way. I talk to doulas and they say it's very rare today to see a disc-like placenta. They've become more ovoid, whatever reason that might be. Anyway, disc in the original. By contrast, if you look at the placenta and how they develop in mammals, that is to say animals, then usually these placenta develop not all the way around, but in a kind of a band, like a belt, around a certain portion of the sacs that surround the embryo. That says they don't have this kind of halo, shall we say, around the full configuration of embryo and surrounding membranes at the beginning. By contrast, it tends to be more partial, shall we say. So there are big differences if you look at them, even if those mammals are, in terms of appearances, getting closer and closer to the look of a human. Yes.
When you're talking about those 4 weeks and those different steps, is there any correlation to when you become a teen? You know, to me, I think like there's a point where they go inward and then they try to express in a really emotional, physical way, then they sort of come back, reshape, and then stand.
Yes, yes. You may know that in Greek mythology, we mentioned this in the faculty meeting earlier today, there's a principle called pars pro toto. This is not to be confused with the Wizard of Oz. Pars pro toto. This means that in every part, the whole is reflected. So likewise, if you think about a part, a portion, a period of human development, you can watch how the whole of the story is kind of miniaturized in any one stage. And yes, at the risk of generalizing, I would say that if you look at the 4 levels of high school, just as one example, you could see something of the zygote in the 9th grade, something of the blastula in the 10th grade. This would take some unpacking to look at the curriculum, but nonetheless, something of the blastula in the 10th grade. There is something of the gastrula in the 11th grade, and there's the beginnings of the shining initiations that comes later perhaps, but at least the beginnings of this gesture of integrity in the 12th grade. And certainly I would say the high school curriculum is intended to work with those 4 gestures in this way with the 4 levels of high school. Yes. All right, okay, so to finish then with the last potential controversies here. We're talking about these 4 bodies again. I mentioned to you the suggestion earlier of a gender in one reflected in the complementary gender 1 level up at the level of the life body. But in talking about this, Steiner says that once you get past this living body, it makes no more sense to speak about the gender or the sexuality of the soul body or the I. He says the soul life is not gendered. You don't have a female astral body or a soul body. You don't have a male ego. You have an ego. Now, the way in which your I and your soul interacts with your gender-based physical living body, yes, that's different. I mentioned that earlier. But he goes on to say that the actual I is not male or female. Now, the controversy here is, as you know, there is a lot of discussion now about what is called sexual identity. And to the degree that you're talking about the identity of the physical organism, or for that matter, the living organism, you may very well speak about its sexual character, its sexual identity. But if you move that then into the soul life and into the I, then you're entering realms that are much more complicated. Now, I say that because there is a lot of discussion right now around the question of how one identifies oneself sexually. And especially then if one moves from one gender to the other. This is now increasingly happening. I don't know about this school, but certainly most Waldorf schools I visit now will have cases of transgender children, mostly in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade. It's very early. Sometimes doesn't express itself till later on, but if you track it back, you may find that what might be, say, becoming evident in the high school already has a long history in the lower schools. So there are Waldorf schools quite actively working now with transgender children and questions of bathrooms and everything else in the lower schools. So the question is, what is happening there? And can one speak about one's identity in terms purely of sexuality? This is a very delicate matter because for those, especially for those who wish to move from one gender or maybe have no gender at all, that's another case that's happening now, this is called asexuality. If you're moving from one gender to another or to no gender at all, you're obviously involved in a physical change, definitely a living condition, definitely a psychological change of lifestyle and other things as well. However, there are cases where these changes are sometimes made in search of identity. And there have been cases now that have been documented of people who went from one gender, let's say, to another gender, having completed, after many years, you can imagine, many years of painful surgery, and hormone treatment, all kinds of things. They arrive at this other objective and discover they have not actually achieved the goal. That is, they have not found their identity. because the identity does not reside in the sexuality. It resides in the identity. And although there may be cases where one transition is necessary for any number of reasons, it's important that people going through that change receive the kind of advice and counseling so they don't have false expectations about the outcome. Now I'll say something a bit more controversial yet. We don't really know what's happening with a child that says, I'm not a boy, I'm a girl. Or even interesting, when the other peers say, you're not a boy, you're a girl. Is this the kids no long before the rest of us? What's going on? We don't know what's happening there. But if you follow through this idea of a physical sexuality matched in a complementary living sexual way, that is to say, a physical body of one gender accompanied by the living body of the other gender, if you imagine that, then the question may arise, does that happen every time? Could there be cases where you are born into the world with both, let's say, a male physical body and a masculine-oriented, living physical organism? And if you follow that thought through, at least the logic of it, suggests the possibility that those people wishing to make the transition at the physical level may actually be wishing to complete the complementary rather than simply change their gender. This may sound complicated, but I say that only because in conversations with some people who've been through that experience, at least a couple of people describing it, and it's in this book here, they describe it and they say that the transition from one gender to the other was not to switch genders, but rather was to release a one-sidedness. They felt they were too much this way, and therefore by changing the physical gender, they felt somehow more a whole human being. And that's a different way to think about, then, the transition of genders as being simply switching genders, as to being completing the wholeness out of a situation that may have felt somehow incomplete or one-sided or too much of one thing, just as a speculative thought. But it does go back to this notion as to what sexuality is and what it is not. I think it's important to recognize that when we are talking about identity, we're talking about something that goes beyond sexuality. Now, to finish out with the last few items here, having to do with what's in this book and then also what's in the air in terms of issues, I thought it might be helpful just to take one more step with this question about gender and identity, not in terms of the body now, but more in terms of the environment. You know there are two arguments out there. One that says, and I'll kind of put it simply now, one that says, boys will be boys, girls will be girls, they have to get through it and get over it, and that's just the way boys are, and that's how girls do things, and so let's put up. And the other perspective says, oh, no. They're basically all the same. And if you're being boyish, it's simply because you were acculturated to being a boy. And if you had grown up in different circumstances, you as a boy would have been as likely to play with dolls as your sister, and your sister as likely to play with trucks as you, the boy, may be. We're all the same. Familiar? This, for me, is a sterile argument. Sorry about the pun. It's a sterile argument because I think those people who are saying boys will be boys and girls will be girls and it's just the way it is and you put up with it, we're different and just get on with it. They're paying attention to the physical and the life body, where there are two genders. And my feeling is that those people who say, no, we're basically all the same and the sexual roles are simply induced by our culture, I think they're paying attention to the soul, body, and the eye, where we are all the same, because we're neither gender. So therefore, that's why I think the argument doesn't get anywhere, because they're talking about different aspects of the human being. The one talking about the more physical living aspect, the other talking more about the psychological and eye aspect of the human being. And if those two sides could recognize the whole picture, I think they would reconcile many of their angry disputes as to whether we're hoodwinking children to becoming girls and seducing them to becoming boys, and if we left them alone, they would be something else. Now, having said that, it is true that the play of children can be much more flexible than sometimes we think it is. Nonetheless, if you've had twins, and had one of each, of different genders, that is to say, you may be surprised as how same they are and yet how different they can become, especially when they go through puberty before they approach their older age. So, yes.
So how do you approach this conversation with your students? Like how, I have a 10-year-old who today was telling me how girls and boys are different. And he was actually saying that girls hold grudges and boys don't hold grudges as much. And you know, well, he just keeps telling me things of this nature, and how much do you talk to them about this and the bodies and all that?
At that age, not.
Yeah.
So what do you do? Well, it really depends what you hear in their question. Here's a classic one, which is not exactly on your topic, but it's close. The kids will ask you, where did I come from? Take a deep breath. Remember some of the embryology you learned in college, biochemistry perhaps, some genetic theory, and you begin to talk about there was one case of a girl who put this question to her mother, where did I come from? And the mother began to describe, the girl in the womb, the kid, stop. I don't care how I got out of there. I want to know how I got in there. Much better question. So, when these kids put these questions, the first thing you have to figure out is, what is the real question here? And usually there's a question hiding behind the presented question because they're trying desperately to make themselves understood in your language, so they kind of do the best they can. But actually, they're often asking a quite different question. And your job is to find out what that question is. And once you do that, not to interrogate them, but nonetheless through gentle discourse, once you begin to get a sense of where did that question come from, or why are you asking, or what prompted you to ask that, then usually in that process of trying to excavate the question, if you're lucky, a metaphor occurs to you. And you may find yourself saying something you never thought of before. It's not that you don't believe it, it's in the moment quite credible. But the point is you hadn't pre-digested or hadn't pre-scripted that. That is, you get help from them and they tell you what to say if you're tuned into it. So that in a way is my first response. That when they ask you questions, the chances are they're asking a different kind of question from the one you're hearing. And the trick is to find out what that question is. I would say the earlier they are, the wiser is their question. And a very young child is probably asking a question of Aristotelian metaphysics. You better have studied some philosophy to be ready to answer your 3-year-old. And of course, you can't answer with Aristotle, you have to answer with mythology and with images and so forth. And, Waldorf has some repertoire to help you out with rainbows and things like that. But you have to, in a way, to invent your own, because if you borrow metaphors, the kid sees right through you. And says, you're a phony. And you have to believe in Santa Claus if you're going to persuade the kid that Santa Claus is coming. So I can't answer more than that, really, because it is a kind of very gentle discussion that is scripted by beings beyond ourselves, if you're fortunate. Anything else? Yes?
It just made me remember a woman I found online, I don't know if anyone knows Deanna Layam.
Who?
Is it Deanna Layam?
Oh,
She
yes.
does the red tent.
Yep.
And how she describes to her 4-year-old about the bird building the nest and explaining to her 4-year-old the menses that she has. So
Yes.
I liked that.
Exactly. Yeah. There is help out there just to give you to stimulate your imagination. Thank you. Okay. So to come to the last parts here, because you see there are a few more things I just wanted to mention, in the sense that if you think about this trend now, the trend towards the transgender, the trend towards the bisexuality or asexuality, I think there's a significance to the fact that this is now happening with younger and younger people. And one can speculate as to what's going on there. I don't want to be too wild in what I say about that. But I do find it interesting that young people in their teenage years are beginning to articulate very different ways of being in the world sexually. And at least among their peers, in some circles at least, are being quite accepted for their views. Some, as you know, young people will no longer take the gender he or she. They have different language. They want pronouns that are neutral as regard to the gender. And the fact that they are moved towards that, I think, is more than just a fashion. The reason I say that is if we now take the very, very long view, in describing that, on one hand, Liliana indicated that we are now at a certain stage in our development, but we're not done yet. There's more to happen yet. And he describes a condition a bit like the original Egyptian mythology of the union of the first being, or Plato's story where he has the human being as one male, female, all in one being. And he says, at a moment where we decided to split, then we were, in a sense, cut in Plato's story into the one gender and the other. And this gesture of cutting in Latin is secare, which gives us the word sex. Sex is to cut, that is to divide between one gender and the other. However, if you think of the story of original union, divided then by sexuality, then we can take that story a bit further and see what could the future be in terms of the rapprochement between two genders who were divided initially in their unfolding. You can see that sometimes in old people. You take a walk behind an old married couple. Who's the wife? Who's the husband? You know, the man has begun to become a bit more rounded a bit. Sometimes the voice a little higher, more pipey. In the case of the woman, maybe become a little less feminine, a bit more masculine. Little indicators there. Just a hint. There's something that's kind of going in this direction. No longer this adolescent splitting into two different races. Now something of a reorienting, a bit of return to something that's a bit more shared. That's one picture for our own age. But to look into the far future, the question as to whether the division that we've experienced embryologically, but also mythologically, whether that division has a future of reunification. It's just a question for the future. And if that is a question for the future, then these early signs of something in young people wishing to somehow either throw off the stereotypes of sexuality or not have a sexuality at all, or be both, be metrosexuals or bisexual, all examples of trying to somehow not just mix things up, but in some sense bringing to reunion a condition that had been severed. And of course, that has a long story yet to run. But in that context now, I just wanted to add a few more things. You may know that we are in an age where actually among the young people, sexual activity, and more precisely sexual pregnancy, is in decline. The number of either unwed mothers or pregnancies or teenage births peaked in the 1990s. And since the 1990s, the case of teenage pregnancy has fallen by about a third. And teen pregnancies also has fallen off by about a quarter. And of course, all manner of practical explanations for that. Fears about AIDS, maybe more sophisticated use of contraception, possibly other practical configurations as well. But I wonder if something else is happening. Whether already the young people are beginning, out of who knows what wisdom, to move a bit past the standard applications and behaviors of sexuality. Now, this is not altogether a happy story, because you may know that they have, despite whatever protections you have on your machines and your computers, they have incredible access to very detailed and graphic and often pornographic material concerning sexuality. They know a lot more than we knew when we were their age, and possibly than we know even today. They know a lot. And it is the nature of knowledge around sexuality that knowledge about sexuality tends to inhibit its expression. The more you know about sex, the less likely you are to be sexually engaged. This has been the kind of surprise that happened in Denmark when they opened up the whole industry of pornography, and people said, what's going to happen to all these people? And the teen rates of sexuality and behavior of sexuality generally by adults decline. It can even become pathological, and these are now cases we begin to see coming out of psychological literature, in which especially boys who have been greatly exposed to pornography, especially on the internet, are unable to be sexually active. A certain inhibition has crept in there because of the super perfected images that they have been exposed to, and of course reality is very far short of some of these ideals or some of these perversions.
Right, so can I ask what that then does to their life body in terms of integrating all of that and then, connecting personally? So I think Times did an article, I don't know, are you seeing that much at the high school level?
Yes. I am seeing it, I will say maybe less among Waldorf schools, but certainly when you step outside Waldorf schools more extremely. And if I just offer one sort of little symptom of that, if I look at especially boys now who may have had this great exposure to this material, of course it's through a medium, and the medium also has its own impact, never mind the content, that the medium itself has impact. And one symptom that I observe is that these boys look prematurely old. They walk like old, they walk like me. They have old type medical conditions, bones, muscles, diabetes, various conditions that we normally associate with age, they have as teenagers.
So are you
I'm not
saying,
blaming that on pornography, don't get me
No.
wrong. But if you take the whole picture, that is to say this over-obsession with sexual activity, which actually inhibits sexual arousal in the end, initially not, but in the end, then you can appreciate that's a condition analogous to a very old male.
so are you saying the ossification that would occur somehow astrally, their body, it's affecting astrally their physical body?
Yes. Or to put that in a slightly more general way, to say that in any kind of sense impressions, if those sense impressions come ready-made, like an image, then obviously you don't have to furnish an image because it's handed to you. If you don't have to furnish an image, you don't have to activate your imagination. If you don't activate your imagination, you're not going to have those kind of youthful, emotional lives that go with being imaginative and creative. And if you are deprived, or at least if you turn away from an active involvement with images and imagination, you're going towards what you describe as this ossification of the soul.
Yeah.
Ossification of the soul is precisely the inability to create images.
Right, because they sometimes happen upon the pornographic stuff by accident.
Oh yeah, sure.
But I don't know, I'm just dealing with what this means,
Yeah.
right, for our children.
And in all cases, it means three things. It means we have to identify the condition, we have to spot it. Then we have to find remedies for it. And then we have to apply the remedies. We're pretty good at the first one. The second one, the third one is really hard. By which I mean that if we recognize that we have a generation, especially now since 9/11, a generation that has grown up with a lot of preset images and somewhat frozen in a condition of fear, that's a pretty toxic combination, then we realize, okay, that's the condition, then the response has to be an ever more activation of their imaginative capacities, because they still have the capacities, they're just not using them. So now what might have been spontaneously happening, maybe behind the bushes and so on, now has to be, I wouldn't say fabricated, but has to be stimulated by other things in education and the arts and other things we do in dinner time conversation, so that we're more conscious of developing imagination, not less.
Right, because, can I just ask, because with regard to the Waldorf curriculum, I don't know, all schools, I guess, are working with this right now in terms of how they're choosing a curriculum. I know it's embedded, the sexual curriculum, it's not really a curriculum, it's embedded, at different, all from kindergarten all the way along. But what are you seeing now as a result of your publication and, people reaching out to you in your own personal experience? How are Waldorf schools working in middle school and in high schools with the curriculum?
I was very careful in this book not to prescribe a curriculum.
Right.
And that was maybe perverse on my part, but it was also deliberate. But I did try to offer some suggestions in terms of a kind of a wedding cake approach to this subject, in the sense that I think it deserves 3 layers of attention. The first is physical, the second is psychological, and the third is spiritual. Physical is obvious what we need to do. Like any kid in any school, they need to be protected. They need to take care of themselves. And that's one thing. They may not listen to you, but nonetheless, that's what they need. In that sense, at the physical level, a curriculum on human sexuality is all about self-protection. It's all about me. Interesting, there have been some public schools that have developed programs like that, and they're very unsuccessful, unless they happen to be combined with another course on what is sometimes called self-esteem. And now you get into a whole course that has to do with how you deal with other people and how you build self-image out of your environment and these things. And that makes good sense to me, because if your physical curriculum, or curriculum on the physiology, which is about you, is combined then with a psychological curriculum that is based on human relationships, then you've moved from a curriculum that's purely selfish to one that is interrelational, that is between me and thee, me and my circumstances. And that's 2 out of 3. Because if the first part is purely selfish and self-centered, rightly so, on the physical body, your protection, and the second level is interactive, then you can see the third part is not about me, it's about thee. And at the spiritual level, a curriculum on human sexuality needs to address the question of thou, not the question of me. Because obviously, sexuality in the end is not simply personal, it's not even relational alone. It's about the consequences of that relationship. And that affects thee and thee and thee and thee and possibly thy children. So for me, yes, there is a curriculum to be developed, and there are schools that are working. Give full due to the personal at the physical level. Give full due at the psychological level to human relations. But don't forget the third level, which is often overlooked. The third level that talks about human sexuality, not in terms of me, but in terms of my community. And then we have the full picture.
Do you have a recommendation? There was an article in Time a while ago about how pornography affects, how young men are advocating turning it off because it leads to erectile dysfunction and it leads to strained relationships, and it kind of went into a little bit less about how it affects girls, although it does affect them in profound ways. But it mentioned that the average age that a boy sees pornography is between 10 and 12. And that's even when parents really try to protect them from that. Do you have any suggestions for parents and teachers as to if we should talk to our children about that, and how and when?
Yes. On the one hand, I have to say, as I said earlier on, matters of sexuality are so individual. It's very difficult, I would say dangerous, to give general guidelines, do this at this age and that and so forth. It is very much according to the individual child and, frankly, his or her family. But having said that, I would say, yes, in our culture we can predict that it will happen. This is no longer a question of not my kid. All kids will have this exposure, and it's almost impossible to protect it. And if you do prevent it, you're probably causing more damage in other areas of a kind of Luddite education. So we have to get used to that reality. So if we know that, then the question is, what is the countervailing gesture we can come up with? If we can't prevent it, what can we do to countervail it? And I would say it has to do with these 3 levels. On the one hand, yes, one should speak to them about physical protection and consequences of exactly what you described. And it's nice to have empirical evidence, because the 10th grader will take it much more easily from the magazine than from you. So having material is helpful, and the Research Institute for World Education, for which I work, and there are brochures over there to describe it, we have gathered articles on the website to talk about the kind of materials that you might find useful, like the research you cited. So that's the physical level. Then, however, it comes to this interrelational level. And there, notice, much of that work proceeds through metaphor. and image and story and fable and legend and things you come up with in your own creation or what you happen to have read. To put it in a simplistic example, is it a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence that in the 7th grade the students often study knighthood and the highest form of love, totally unrequited. Or that in the 5th grade you talk about the Greeks in terms of their balance between one side of themselves and the other. There are things embedded in the curriculum that are intended to redress, shall I say, or to countervail these inevitable consequences of modern life. But you can certainly help out more in the home with these kinds of stories. I would possibly hang on to the 3rd level till a little later, because that's a bit of a heavy trip to lay on a 10-year-old about the responsibilities you have to your peers and so forth. Except to say that it's helpful for the 10-year-old to know that if they begin to carry certain pictures of the human being, those pictures have reality. And they might start off as pornographic images, but if they are carried, they can become potent, even to the reasons that you mentioned. And I wouldn't say you tell it quite that way to a 10-year-old, but if you find a better language than I can offer you, because I'm a high school teacher, if you can find a better language, it's a way of saying to a 10-year-old that the way you carry yourself has impact upon the world, and the world has impact on you. And if you want to be your best person, you have to work according to your images, not what the world tells you is an image.
Right.
And that's getting at this notion of imagination again, whereby the student expresses this imaginative life as opposed to this imposed pictorial life coming through the media. And for the rest, it's just being practical and alert and staying up later than they stay up. And to say nothing about the whole hygiene of the computer. That's not our subject this afternoon, but there are really ways, I think, in which we know enough now to say there's a very good reason why cell phones do not belong in the bedroom at all. Not yours and not theirs. Ditto other things you could say. But that's the practical nature, getting more to the technology question than the sexuality question. But there are practical things, and we now know enough. One doctor says that this whole issue of technology in the 21st century may be the asbestos of our century. We're going to have to experience things, and we are experiencing things, and the evidence is coming in. Read Electronic Silent Spring, an incredible resource of all kinds of studies, most of them done outside this country, because outside this country are not the lobbyists to prevent information from getting out. So in those other countries, they can just do the research and publish it without fear of suppression.
Electronic what?
It's called an Electronic Silent Spring.
May I ask, are you planning in the near future a colloquium about this with Waldorf schools, or are you currently kind of just working with maybe, how do they work in high schools? Do they have counselors? Do they have, I mean, some schools are lucky enough to have a doctor, right? But are high schools trending towards counselors where they're working with their students, or?
The quick answer is yes, and the first question of this answer is no. I'm glad to have written the book and
Okay,
get it behind me.
Maybe there's a colloquium that works.
But others who would follow up in a certain sense, that's what I try to do. I try to make material available for those who might be willing to follow. I'm conscious of the time, and therefore I want to wrap this up.